How should we handle adversaries and enemies? In today's devotional, Nehemiah gives us 3 strategies for dealing with opposition. Welcome to the Word for 2022. Today we're in Nehemiah chapter 6. Now God had placed a burden and a calling upon Nehemiah to rebuild the wall and city of Jerusalem. But from the very beginning, the task was met with opposition and enemy scheming. Devotional writer Kayla Ferris, she noted that in the second half of the project, the enemy used 3 tactics to stop the work of God: distraction, deception, and deviation. And Satan still uses those 3 tactics against me and you. Let's look at the first. It was distraction. It's the favorite tool that the enemy wants to use. It's the ploy to get us to focus upon something other than our true mission and purpose. It's sometimes subtle and sometimes it seems innocent. It's where we replace something good with actually what is best. 4 times in this chapter, Nehemiah is presented with something that is a distraction, but he handles it the same way every time. We read in verse 3 his response to these distractions. He says, "I'm carrying on a great work, and I cannot go down to you. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" Nehemiah, he kept his focus on the main thing. And whenever Satan tries to distract us, we need to do the same. Keep our eye on the main thing. When distraction didn't work, then the enemy turned to deception. A letter was written that was full of lies against Nehemiah. The enemy will always try to spread lies. He's the father of lies, and he will always try to spread rumors because he wants us to fear. And he wants us to be focused on defending ourselves so that we won't have any energy or time to do what God has called us to do. How did Nehemiah deal with deception? He prayed, it says. There he prayed, "Lord, now strengthen my hands." He called out the lie for what it was. He said that they were just making things up in their head. He knew what the truth was, and so he was going to not focus there, but he said, "Lord, strengthen my hands to keep doing what you called me to do." The third tactic was that of deviation. Now, Satan always wants to get us again focused on something else. Here, he was trying to get Nehemiah discredited. For Nehemiah, it was, go hide in the temple. You need to save your own life. Go where you're not supposed to go, for only the priests were to go into the temple. How did Nehemiah answer this? In verse 11, he said, "Should a man like me run away? I will not." And then because he had spiritual discernment, he said, "I realized that God had not sent him." It takes spiritual discernment to know beyond human activity into the spiritual realm. What is God's will and what is Satan's activity? That comes by spending time with the Lord in prayer. And that's what Nehemiah did. He prayed, and then God gave him the spiritual discernment that he needed. As we read this chapter, we need to understand that throughout the entire mission that God had given to Nehemiah, there was always a relentless undercurrent of opposition. It came from both outside and inside the walls. It came from the outside and inside the camp, unfortunately. As you read this chapter, there are some lessons that you need to pull out from it on how to deal with adversaries and enemies. One is this: whenever you're striving to obey God, you need to expect opposition. I once heard a line that I really liked: whenever the light is on, bugs will come. And that's what we see in this chapter. Another truth is that whenever you respond to God's invitations, don't be caught by surprise when adversaries try to thwart what you're doing. Satan will not leave you alone. If you are doing what God has called you to do, Satan will be opposing. He will be attacking. In fact, persecution and opposition may be the best evidence that you are right in the center of God's will, doing what He called you to do. If you didn't have opposition, you're probably not a threat to the enemy. As we deal with our enemies, I love what Henry Blackaby said. He once wrote, "If you concentrate on your opponents, you will be sidetracked from God's activity. If you're always focusing upon what the enemy is doing, you're going to lose sight of what God is really doing." And then he also said, many times, the most rewarding spiritual work is done in the crucible of persecution and opposition. Therefore, be alert to the spiritual warfare that's going on all around you. It is real. And it is potentially disastrous both for you and those you care about. As you read this chapter, we again need to understand that Satan's desire is to lure us into sin and to distract us. So how do we deal with opposition when the enemy is coming in? We need to deal with it the same way that the early church did. In Acts chapter 4, when the early church encountered persecution, the disciples, they didn't ask God to remove their opposition, but they asked that God would give them boldness to stand against and face opposition. This is what we read in Acts chapter 4. The disciples prayed, "Lord, consider their threats and enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness. Stretch out your hand to heal. Perform miraculous signs and wonders through the name of your holy servant Jesus." And after they prayed, the place where they were meeting, it was shaken. That's the way to handle opposition. It's to pray and rely upon God. Focus upon doing what God has called you to do and leave the results up to Him. Thank you for joining the Word for 2022.